Our next guest just had a baby. Yay!
Actually, my wife just had the baby.
That's true. And he also leads one of the most important, humble, yet powerful organizations in Lancaster. We love him.
Yes.
Welcome to The Behaviorist with Work Wisdom, where we help you adopt high-performance mindsets, behaviors, communication, and culture. I'm your host, Sarah Colantonio, and we also have...
Kedren Crosby.
Thanks for coming in.
Sure.
And today on our podcast, our guest is Mike McKenna, the CEO of Tabor Community Services. Hi, Mike.
Hi. How are you guys?
Good.
We're great.
How much sleep are you getting?
Not much. The girls are alternating who wants to be up on which hour. So it's really good. Though Catherine definitely has the harder end of it. So
yeah. Well, let's give her our love.
I will.
So is it true 1 is like none and 2 is like 10? Is that true?
Yes.
Okay.
That's how it's.
That's the math.
It's crazy. You think you're unprepared for the first one, which is definitely true.
Yeah.
And then you bring home 2 and you're like, oh, you're prepared for the newborn stage. You at least know what's happening there. But then you have a toddler who still has all the same expectations she did before you went to the hospital. And you're like, oh dear, what can we do for you? So we're kind of like man to man right now. I'm focused on the toddler and Catherine's focused on the infant for the most part. And every now and again you get a strategic switch in there, and that really helps keep things moving.
This could be a topic that we focus on: leadership styles in parenting.
And
division of labor and delegation,
Actually,
empowerment.
We talked about the Enneagram before, and I got a parenting book with the Enneagram.
Really? Oh my gosh.
That's figure great. Out our parenting style.
Oh,
how about smart.
We haven't done it yet because
EQ
we've been too busy. But in theory, we're going to do it.
That's great. Glad to know it exists.
Yeah. Well, interesting. Well, we could try that with the 2 dogs that we now have.
Yeah.
It's not the same. I know.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Let's get to it. So let's start with the first question we have for you, which is actually, it's not a question. It's just asking you to describe the essence of your work in a word or a phrase.
Well, I think if I look for Tabor specifically, I would use the phrase opening doors. Everything we've done for the past 50 years has really been around this notion of creating opportunity and housing for people and being able to give them the skills and tools they need to have promising futures financially and stable futures in terms of housing. And then if I think in terms of my career overall, I'd probably think about this phrase of going upstream for solutions that work for people who are vulnerable. Every place I've worked has really been focused on some aspect of access deficiencies, lack of opportunity, and then trying to connect the dots to make sure that those opportunities can happen.
An upstreamist, my favorite kind of leader.
So tell me a bit about how you came to learn what your core values are.
It started with the nuns.
It started
with my parents, but then the nuns really helped. They really help you define your values pretty quickly. But actually, in my case, it was a very, very promising way. It was a school run by the Sisters of Mercy. So they really focused on corporal works of mercy. And there was a woman who worked there who was head of campus ministry who was truly a servant leader. And she exposed me and all my classmates and my sisters, as did my parents, to lots of opportunities to do service with people who were very different than I was. So it gave me a sense of kind of what the real world looks like and all its good aspects and some of the not so good aspects. And then you have formative experiences, as everyone does. I had some really intense experiences, one in Camden, one in New Mexico on the U.S.-Mexico border in Tijuana, working with migrants, that really kind of crystallized for me, like, what was my calling? And it had to be something giving back to others. And then later on, I had an experience when I was working with the Foreign Service and the State Department, and that helped crystallize another one of my values, which was family is so important to me, and that's kind of number one. And having a career as a diplomat where you're in a new place every 2 to 3 years wasn't really compatible for that goal that I had in terms of being present for my family, being a good husband, being a good father. for any diplomats listening, I'm not trying to say that you're not those things. I'm just saying it wasn't
Shaming.
the right fit for me.
Diplomat shaming. So I'm interested in how you developed your values and how you learned what your values were. How do your values shape what you decide to do?
Yeah, that's been really critical. I've had a few experiences where I was able to kind of boil down to the essence, including an exercise working with Kedren to really define kind of what my core values were. I think everybody knows them intuitively or implicitly, but sometimes you just need to like stare them in the face to be like, oh yeah, this is the most important thing to me. And that exercise was really helpful as I was kind of discerning career opportunities. So I'm new to Tabor. I've been there since October. Prior to that was a COO at another nonprofit called Community Action Partnership. Both very fulfilling jobs, but was starting to feel like there was going to be a new chapter for me. But I knew that whatever that new chapter was, it had to fit with the core values. And I mentioned two of those, with the family and the focus on people who are low income. Another is really this idea of looking at kind of what works, looking for the truth, in kind of a big spiritual sense, but also really in a pragmatic sense as it relates to like what works for people who are struggling. What are the reasons that people are struggling? How do we figure that out? And I knew there was going to be, when I'm looking at an opportunity, and I wanted it to be in senior leadership in a nonprofit, it had to meet those three. And so when the opportunity for Tabor came along, I really looked at what that organization was all about. I was drawn to the fact that it had this faith founding by a very courageous Mennonite woman who said, housing discrimination sucks and we need, as Christians, to do something about it. And I also knew that an executive leadership position, a president position, was going to be demanding in ways that might take me away from my family. And so how could I balance those two things? And that's when I was offered the position, I said, look, I'm going to need more time off because I'm expecting another child. I'm a dad who already likes spending time with my children. So what can we do there? And thankfully they were willing to accommodate that request. But I thought that was really important. A wise person told me to have my cake and eat it too when those opportunities came along. And so I did ask those questions to say, how can this job be compatible with all the values and not just one or two of them? Yeah. Because if it wasn't all adding up, I figured I probably wouldn't be happy in the long run.
Have you ever had an experience where you have a value that's one of these deeply held beliefs that guides behavior, and you had a lot of frustration because the behavior you had to have was incongruent with one of your deeply held beliefs? Has that ever happened to you in your work life? And can you talk a little bit about how maybe you came to understand that value even more because of the incongruence? Yeah,
that's a really good question. I think my time in DC comes to mind. I got to work on some really interesting issue campaigns while I was working for a nonprofit in DC. And I learned so much from that experience. I loved the mission. I loved my colleagues. But one of the things that was really challenging was I really wanted to be able to prioritize my time with Catherine. We were newlyweds at the time, and I had a very long commute from where we were living. And it was getting increasingly sort of taxing to have that long commute, the time apart. We're both working a lot. And ultimately, as much as I loved the work that organization was doing, I knew that I would need to find a job that could really meet me where I needed to be in terms of prioritizing that family. And I don't know that I would have been able to articulate it as clearly at that time. It was just like you have the general frustration. You come home worn out, and it just sort of erodes your quality of life over time. Looking back on it, I think that was a major factor, even though it was meeting some of my other expectations as far as focus on an issue of people who are vulnerable, and we were solving things, we were generating ideas, and we were coming up with sort of the quote-unquote truth as it related to this particular challenge that our society faced. So it was checking some of the boxes, but not all of them, and ultimately it did prompt me to seek a different opportunity.
I love how frustration can be crystallizing. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the transition from being the vice president of another organization to the president of your present organization?
Yeah, that's been my every day for
Yeah.
the past 6 months. So I think one of the things that has been really exciting is sort of being intentional about shifting the mindset. So there's a mindset that I think suits you well as a COO, and there's a different mindset that you need to have as a president. And there's certainly similarities to the role, and one of those would be that it's about strategy in both roles, but in the COO role, you're really helping to implement a strategy. And in a president role, you are setting the strategy. Obviously, both, with partners, with input from lots of other voices, but that's kind of the mandate. The other thing that I think is very similar is relationships. They're central to both. So I knew that was something that had worked well for me as a VP. I knew I had to prioritize that as a president. But there were some other things that were important for me to sort of let go of. So one of the things that I loved as a COO was like being in the thick of it with program performance, program design, what was the client experience. As president, I still care about those things, but it's not my primary focus. I know I have other competent people on my team who are digging in a little more on that area, and I need to be shifting to some other things. And two of them that were kind of new for me, as I'm sure is new for everybody the first time they're in a president role in a nonprofit. One is the donor relationships. That was new. I did not have that responsibility as a COO at my previous agency. But it goes back to that point around relationships. It turns out, as much as I thought going in that there was some sort of rocket science behind development and donor relations, it turns out it's just like, be authentic, talk to people, listen to what they care about, and make those connections between what Tabor's doing and what they care about. And thankfully I have great teammates on my development team who already have those strong foundations, which open the door to sort of develop those relationships for myself. The other is around the board. I was, as a COO, providing information to the board, providing information to the CEO, who was ultimately accountable to the board of directors, certainly went to all the board meetings. I've served on some boards myself as a community rep, but now having 14 people who are very interested in the work of the organization, interested in me as the new leader of that organization, that really took some focus. And I have had some really good learning experiences in the first 5 months of kind of, this is what works for this person, this is not what works for that person. And you're learning each of their respective styles, what aspects about Tabor is what they're most passionate about, and what kind of strategies I can use as the executive to keep the whole group well-informed and engaged. And that's been something that as a president, you really need to prioritize, whereas as a COO, that's really not your domain.
Something that you do that I really appreciate, and I think our listeners might also really learn from, is when you have to step up and into a new role, there might be something that feels a little daunting, like fund development or board management, but you have a practice of looking into where your strengths are and cutting and pasting and saying, oh, well, I'm already good at making friends and having relationships, and I'm already assertive, and I can already do those things. How do I just cut and paste these onto this new opportunity? So whereas some leaders might feel that they're sort of stuck and feel that it's too daunting, that they can't move forward, you're resourceful in saying, well, what's already in my toolbox that I can use here?
Yeah. I
think that'll carry you well. Yeah.
And I think I talked to some other people to say like, okay, well, I'm thinking this could be a good match for some of the same reasons that you just described. But I talked to other people to be like, hey, what do you think? Me and Tabor, could we be happy together? And other people said, well, it seems like you've done this well, so I think that will serve you well at Tabor, or aspects of things that are important to me about the mission that they recognize in my work. So it was helpful to know that myself, but helpful to get it validated externally so that I wasn't sort of too confident about, what I brought to the next opportunity.
Yeah, that sounding board.
Did anything surprise you in this new role?
Definitely. Yeah. So I think there was certainly the challenge of, when you're in a vice president role for an extended period of time, you get pretty good at it. Like you feel confident, right? You feel fluent in the tasks of the job and the expectations of the role. And then you're moving up as a president, and you're like, okay, so I'm a beginner again. I'm the most senior person in the organization, but also the newest.
Right.
And you're learning all these new requirements of the new role and the new responsibilities of the role. It does help to know your skill set so you can kind of apply those same things, but you have to have a level of humility to be like, I've got a lot to learn here, especially for an organization that's 50 years old. Yeah. It may seem like I've got this great new idea. Chances are we did it in the 80s when I was in kindergarten. So it's like, pause there. The other thing that I think I was surprised by, and it's to Tabor's credit, to your intro where you talked about Tabor being a humble organization. We do way more than I even realized. Okay. So there's the different programs that are kind of the signature programs related to homeless services that I was familiar with. I knew about the Financial Empowerment Center, but even within both of those areas, there were so many additional elements. We have a program called Match Savings where we're working with people who have said, we want to go the long distance with you. We'll learn all of these things to learn from financial counseling and budgeting and good behaviors related to money management. We're going to start saving on a monthly basis. And then Tabor's saying, well, we'll invest in you in response, and we'll match people 2 to 1 for every dollar they save, up to $2,000. So $3,000 total. And that can be used for people to put a down payment towards a house, towards acquiring a car, going back to school, anything that's really going to give you a foundation to grow your assets over time. And that was something that I had never heard anyone in the community talk about, but I think it's a really innovative program that has truly been a game changer for the people who've gone through the program in accelerating their journey out of poverty or their journey towards greater levels of self-sufficiency. We also have a wonderful family shelter called TLC that many people have heard of. They're not always aware of the connection with Tabor, but one of the great things about TLC, in addition to the family shelter that's providing, has a whole range of services for veterans who've experienced homelessness. We also have a great program that's doing outreach to landlords called Community Housing Solutions. So there's all these different connections to the community under this broad umbrella of housing that even to someone who thought I knew, being a leader of another nonprofit, what we did, I was like, wow, this is even bigger, you know? And part of the reason that people don't know is because the agency is a little more humble. It's sort of part of its core values. And part of it is because the outreach is happening more organically through various partner organizations and churches. It's not, big promotion through the media necessarily, but that was something that was a real pleasant surprise.
Wow. I think that might be a topic for another podcast, this notion of the paradox of humility and marketing or humility and donor development, because especially here in Lancaster where we have a strong Mennonite background, even in the Catholic worker movement, all of that. It's a paradox that it's challenging for leaders who are in these social justice movements. So maybe we can revisit that again. You want to come back?
I would love to.
Okay, good.
You mentioned your team before. Can you tell me a little about the Tabor bench strength that you inherited and lead?
Yeah. I was both excited and intimidated by that. When an organization's been around for 50 years, it says something about what they've been doing well for that time. And I knew that we had a lot of people who'd worked there for very long periods of time. It's a place where people can build a career, which is an amazing thing for an organization to have. So I had to really be sensitive to the fact that I'm coming in with fresh perspectives and new ideas, but also needed to learn a lot about what we've done in the past. Who are we? Who have we been during that period of time? And I think there was a few things about Tabor that allowed me to kind of get up to speed. And not to say that in 5 months I figured it out, because I haven't, but I'm well on that journey. Part of it is the team has been very welcoming to me in a sincere way. It wasn't like, great, we're in a staff meeting and then we're going to talk about them at the water cooler. And if that's happening, then I'm just oblivious. But my perception is that it's genuine. People are really inviting me into what they do, telling me about it. And I've had multiple members, in particular the vice presidents who report to me directly, say, like, here's why we've done things the way we've done them. And then they'll add in that same sentence, but we don't have to always do it that way, as opposed to other places where I've worked where you hear, well, why would we change it? That's how we've always done it. So there is a receptiveness to different approaches while giving me the context that helps me understand, okay, well, there were really good reasons for XYZ decision. So that's been helpful. The other thing that's been kind of interesting is that we've chronicled our history and our success in interesting ways at each milestone. So we have these 30th, 40th, 50th anniversary books, essentially, that I was able to read through those when I started, and it gave me a sense of, you know, who the players are, what were the issues in the community at the time, and then what was Tabor's response to those issues. And there's a number of programs that I came in thinking, wouldn't it be cool if we could do X? And then it's like, oh, we did that. Great. It was in 1992. You know, like, it's literally there on the book in front of me, and I'm like, circle that and we can revisit it. So that's been exciting. Wow. There's also this great document that was written by one of our founders, a Mennonite woman named Grace Wanger. And she said, looking at this issue of housing discrimination, racially based housing discrimination, and she said, no room in Lancaster. And it's a foundational document. I don't know that many nonprofits can point back to that and say, hey, this was sort of our essence at the moment of our founding, a controversial issue rooted in a faith tradition and the response to that issue. So that's been something that gave me a sense kind of like, when you want to dig deep about what Tabor is, it's in this incredible document from 50 years ago. So
do you call it the manifesto?
I don't. I think we should.
Yeah. Wow. Did you have any trepidation about moving into this role? None. Zero. I can tell by your face.
I mean, Kedren can tell you there may have been some conversations to this effect. Yeah, absolutely. There was trepidation. I think, thankfully, I've worked at places over my career that I was always sad to leave and simultaneously excited about the next thing. So I was able to leave on my own terms, and had really positive connections to those places, but knew that that chapter had ended and now it was time to start a new one. So I felt like that was the case with CAP 2. There was conveniently an article in the New York Times around that time that talked about leaving a job as a form of a process of grief. Even when it's on your own terms and like you go through all those stages of grief. And that was the case at CAP. I had hired most of the people who worked directly with me. We had formed an incredible team. I had gotten to meet so many other incredible people who worked there. We just gelled in many ways. And it felt like a place where I was able to work on some really cool projects. Some of those projects still are in process. I wouldn't say they had concluded during my tenure. So that was something sad too, of like leaving those projects that you really cared about. But I knew about what Tabor was doing. I knew about the reputation it had. I knew about how it was changing the lives of clients. And I was excited about getting to know a whole new team and building that team, and being able to be part of idea generation for its next chapter. So it was definitely bittersweet, but I can't say I've had a single day that I've regretted it at all. It has really been a place where I feel like I can kind of be the best version of myself professionally. And I have just loved that learning process of getting to know the organization and my colleagues and our partners and our donors. It's been a lot of fun.
That is so beautiful. Well, what advice would you give to our listeners who are looking in the face of a potential transition? What advice would you give them?
Well, I have a few that are pretty concrete. One would be do some kind of assessment that evaluates your sort of core behaviors in leadership. For me, it was the emotional intelligence assessment, the EQ, that really illuminated some things that I maybe knew on some level that I was doing well, but hadn't had them broken down into specific behaviors and leadership domains. And then I could look at that and see how I measured up to the standard for other leaders who were in executive positions. And it also showed me areas where I was maybe a little bit lower on the leadership bar and could actually do something about it. So the amazing thing about the EQ is it is not fixed.
Right.
It is something that you can adapt
Thank
based
God.
on practicing new behaviors, unlike the IQ, right? Like
Yeah.
you either have it or you don't.
Yeah.
But with the EQ, like you can pay attention. And one that was low for me, which was a little surprising at first, but then when I dug into it, I was like, oh, this is right, was optimism. I've always thought of myself as a fairly optimistic person. But I realized in some of the ways it was showing up at work that maybe I was a little more negative sometimes about things that were happening. I think part of that was the nature of the COO job. You try to keep a lot of the crap out of the CEO's office.
Right.
So it comes to you, which can shift your mindset a little bit. But as a CEO, I knew I was going to have to be like having that vision of that bright future, that hope that things will change and can change. And so I started paying attention to that a little more. If I saw myself skewing a little bit skeptical or negative about an issue, I'd be like, time out. So that would be something that I think I probably wouldn't have gone down that path if I hadn't gone through the assessment. There's other assessments out there, but the more that you know about how your leadership style is actually showing up to your colleagues at your work, the better you're going to be able to do to become a better leader. And I think listening is really key. And that's sounds cliche, but it is truly the part that you can only figure out sort of what's happening within your workplace if you're listening to the people who know better than you do. And one of the priorities I had in my first month was to meet with every member of the Tabor team. And I asked them 3 key questions. I said, what do you love about Tabor? And then I said, if we could change something or do something differently, what would that be? And then I said, dream big for me. If you could design your own program, forget about budget, just make sure that it fits our mission. What would that look like? And it gave me this wonderful insight into the things that were frustrating for people, but also the dreams that they had of how the housing challenges and financial challenges for people in Lancaster could look different. And also a great roadmap. Now that we're heading into a strategic plan, I could say, here's the input from 47 colleagues. And similar conversations I had with donors and board members wasn't quite that structured, but got a real sense of kind of what they loved about the organization and what things they wanted to see differently about the organization. And most people have both. It's never like black and white, like somebody is truly a cheerleader and somebody else is totally critical. Most people have pretty nuanced views. And that was something that was helpful for me to hear. And I think the third part when you're making the transition is you're going to get lots of input from lots of people. And I strongly recommend that. There's this notion out there of like your personal board of directors, like talk to those people, get their feedback, but then you need to take a step back and reflect on what they said and reflect on how you're feeling about what you've heard or what you've experienced. When I worked at Loyola University in the Center for Community Service and Justice, they do service learning for college students. And we would always say as part of our orientation for those programs, this quote from T.S. Eliot that I absolutely love. And it's, you could have the experience but miss the meaning. And so I think that reflexive leadership is so important. You can do all the stuff, but if you're not synthesizing it and seeing like, well, what is it telling me about who I am or what really matters to me, then I think you could miss some really important meaning there. So that reflection piece is hard when the demands of either the current job you're in or the new job you're starting are coming at you at 180 miles an hour, but you have to make that time and figure out whatever method works for you, but do protect the time for some reflection.
That's good. Mike, we're so grateful to you for being part of this movement of helping world changers in the workplace enhance their individual and collective team performance. Thank you, listeners, for downloading The Behaviorist. We hope you'll subscribe. Please reach out to us through our website, workwisdomllc.com, where you can enjoy Work Wisdom Press and productions, ask questions, and give suggestions of topics you'd like us to explore in future episodes. As is our custom, I think Kedren's going to read the 1 Minute Wisdom by Anthony DeMello.
The master would frequently assert that holiness was less a matter of what one did than of what one allowed to happen. To a group of disciples who had difficulty understanding that, he told the following story. There was once a one-legged dragon who said to the centipede, "How do you manage all those legs? It's all I can do to manage one." "To tell you the truth," said the centipede, "I do not manage them at all."